Thanks so much, Anton, and thank you so much for inviting me here today to bring what I thought would be a slightly different perspective on the Holobiont, but after Rachel's talk might not be as different as I thought it would be. Thank you so much for that inspirational talk. I could not have asked for a better talk to prepare people's mindsets for this talk that I'm going to be giving now. My name is Aviâja. I'm an associate professor at the University of Greenland, probably one of the world's smallest universities. I'm also fortunate to have a part-time assistant professorship here at the Globe Institute at the University of Copenhagen. And for the past 7 years, I have a training from here in applied microbiology and biotechnology, and a PhD in Arctic metagenomics from the Technical University of Denmark. But for the past 7 years, I've been focusing on our indigenous foodways in Greenland. So I was born and raised in Greenland. I'm part of the indigenous community there that identify as Inuit. And just for a little bit of context for those who are not from Denmark, Greenland is a big, sparsely populated island in the Arctic that was a colony to Denmark almost 300 years. Where do I point this? No. It should, oh. Yeah, here we go. Okay, so this is the scope of the conference that we're currently attending. And the tagline is Host Microbe Interactions Under the Microscope. So as we've all heard yesterday and today, there's a lot of incredibly fascinating things to be found under the microscope. And I've already had my mind blown. But what I want to argue today is that there's also some interesting things to find if we look up from the microscope, if we look at the Holobiont in a broader context and look beyond biology. And I think that's especially important if we want the work that we do to actually solve and address global challenges in the 21st century. So I've taken the liberty to bring here a quote from the Wikipedia of the Holobiont. And under the history of the Holobiont, it talks about the holo part, this concept of holism, and holism being that systems should be studied in their entirety with a focus on the interconnections between their various components. So what is the entirety of a system? And Thomas said yesterday, think beyond the host. But what I would like to encourage is that sometimes it's even also beyond that. So I've developed this concept of an Inuit Holobiont, Inuit being our indigenous community. And what you see here is that, of course, you have the microbiome, you have the bacteria, you have the gut at the center, and that is within its host, the human being in this context. But looking beyond that is also our food culture. Rachel said also food is one of the things that impacts the Holobiont the most. And in our context, our food culture is symbolized with the seal, because the seal has always and is still the cornerstone of our indigenous diet. And around the seal, you have this ring of tiny little people symbolizing our society, the community that we grow up in, and the families that we grow up in, because they eventually are connected to what is the food culture that we're eating. And then, of course, beyond that is the nation that we live in, the geography that we live in, where we come from. So in this context, Greenland, as the island that it is. And then again, beyond that, we have the planet. We also have the weather and the climate, because in the Inuit Holobiont, a lot of our connections to microbes come through the food that we eat, and sometimes that food is fermented. And our fermented food, including fermented seal, is a type of fermentation process that's very slightly controlled. So no addition of salt, no control of temperature. We completely rely on the weather and the climate. So in this way, the Holobiont for Inuit is connected to all of these spheres. And I want to support this argument with an example of what happens when we don't think about the Holobiont beyond the biology, but forget that it exists within a context. And I think that's one of the points that Rachel also made with her talk. So this is my primary example. If you Google how to eat for a healthy microbiome, these were the top 3 figures that came up in my Google engine. And what you see is a plant-based solution for how to eat for a healthy gut microbiome. Of course, that has to do with plant fiber, it has to do with Prevotella, it has a lot to do with the HATSA studies that were mentioned just before. So we know this. If we want a healthy gut microbiome, eat a high diversity of plants. But where I come from, we used to eat no plants at all, almost. So we had a diet comprised of 98% animal foods, all of them non-agricultural. So what you see on this plate is a piece of boiled whale, a dried capelin, so the whole fish that you see is a dried fish that we eat whole, essentially eating a holobiont, a piece of dried seal, a piece of dried cod, and some raw whale skin, and a little bit of salt. So August Krogh, Nobel laureate August Krogh, and his wife Marie Krogh phrased the diet of my ancestors in this very eloquent way. The Eskimos are probably the most exquisitely carnivorous people on Earth, living as most of them do almost exclusively on meat and fish. So if this is the diet that you come from, I think that there's a piece missing in our understanding about what sustains a healthy microbiome. I don't believe that my ancestors had chronic leaky gut. I just don't believe that. So we don't have currently a very good understanding of how a healthy animal source diet that's non-agricultural, non-industrial, can sustain a healthy gut. And of course that impacts my community's opportunity to understand how we can eat healthily from the sources that make up our food culture. So this is, to me, what's important about reflecting the context of what we do. And in the same way as with the HATSA studies, we would not understand that there's seasonal, cyclicality to the microbiome if we don't understand HATSA lifestyle, HATSA culture, and the geography that they live in. So I want to highlight a project that integrates the Holobiont but also looks beyond it. So it's the AMASEC project that I'm co-leading with photographer Carsten Ewang, also working together with the head of institute at the Globe Institute, Anders Johannes Hansen, as well as PhD fellow Mads Bjørnsen, who's here today. And in the AMASEC project, this is a research, documentation, and communication project. What we're looking at is what happens when we eat these dried capelin, when we eat these fish, including their gut microbiomes, including everything. They're not heated, they're just dried. But also, in this project, we want to promote our indigenous foodways in Greenland. So we can do both of those things within one project. And the project builds upon previous research. I hope the text is visible up here. Previous research that we did where we looked at different ways of drying the capelin and the food microbiome that results from different ways of drying it. And what we saw is that when we dry the capelin in our traditional ways, either hanging them on the houses or putting them on the crowberries or on the cliff sides, compared to when we do it industrially, we get a higher diversity of microbes. So when we prepare our foods in the traditional way, the food microbiome is more diverse than if we prepare the foods in an industrial way. And that's logical, of course, but it's nice to be able to show that in this specific context. And then this is not strictly part of the research, but information that came up during this research. Capelin have a high content of calcium, of course, because we eat them including their bones and everything. And this is important because in Greenland, we recommend that all children should drink half a liter of milk a day, even though Inuit are lactose intolerant. And this is because of our colonial history. Instead, we could be recommending children to eat dried capelin, perhaps eating a high diversity of microbes, and not have that lactose that really makes us uncomfortable. And then finally, we showed that there's a specific type of dried capelin that's slightly fermented that we collect on the shore. And in those, they're specifically characterized by having a high amount of lactic acid bacteria and propionic acid bacteria. So there's a potential to create propionate in these ones. And this is interesting because propionate is important for gut health. this is not my work, but just to include some references to cite this, propionate, among other things, can induce satiety. So when I bring up this result, people ask me, oh, okay, so maybe you could take those microbes and then you could, upscale and produce a lot of propionate and make some supplements, which people have done, make propionate supplements that could make people full. And I think that's a logical question when we look in the microscope, and also a logical question because I used to be a biotech entrepreneur using microbes. But in the work that I do now, I'd much rather look up and think about, no, I think this result is important as a reminder of why we eat our foods. Why is it that we eat our traditional foods? They might be able to sustain us microbial diversity. They might be able to make us more full. And in talking about restoration and the spectrum there, maybe sometimes you don't need a sledgehammer and you don't even need a scalpel. Maybe sometimes you just need to eat the food that's right in front of you. So in this way, my work has developed into working with food sovereignty and indigenous people's rights around food. So essentially applying omics technologies to indigenous people's rights. And this is important for me because food to us is more than just eating. As it's expressed so nicely here in the white paper on indigenous people's food systems, it says that for indigenous peoples, food carries nutritional, medicinal, healing, spiritual, social, cultural, relational, and emotional dimensions and values. Food is an expression of the linkages between indigenous peoples, lands, waters, other species, and the spiritual world. And you can't put this into a supplement. This is really not something that you can sell to people. It's something that is there in our food system. So other than using an omics approach, I've had to teach myself a novel way of approaching the science that I do, and I use an indigenous framework for this, which makes sense in my specific context. It's very simple and it's very difficult to do. So I've just brought up one of the books that I use for this, and it describes very nicely these 7 principles to be working with if you want to use an indigenous framework for research. And I think this applies so well to the Holobiont, because as you see, the 2 last principles are interconnectedness and holism, which is, and I really enjoyed the conversation yesterday because it really highlighted this, how there's so much room for thinking much more openly about things and be inspired between disciplines in working with the Holobiont. And I think this framework can really encourage that line of thinking as well. This, of course, is not for everybody. You cannot apply this to every research project, and you don't have to. But there are certain contexts where at least I believe that you have to think about this context. And this is especially if you're working with indigenous peoples. So there are several projects that are at a global scale wants to sample and preserve indigenous peoples' microbiomes. Among those, the Microbiome Conservancy Project, as well as the Microbiota Vault. And there's a lot of great reasons for these projects, but it's very, very important that we think with an indigenous framework and in a framework of indigenous people's rights when we want to do this type of work. And Rachel, again, brought one of these citations as well to her talk. Luckily, I'm not the only one with this perspective, and there's been very recently a lot of very exciting literature around how we can work meaningfully with the Holobiont and microbiome work in connection to indigenous peoples, as long as we do it with respect and reciprocity and with a proper ethical framework. And we did a similar publication some years ago with specific focus on my community, on Inuit, and that work was encouraged by some preliminary data on fermented foods from the Arctic, from Inuit. So we have fermented walrus, fermented narwhal, fermented seal, trout, and char. And what you see is that especially in the, not in the fish, but in the walrus and the narwhal and seal, we have a lot of Clostridia. And I see that in some of the data that I have as well, as we've been working with this. And this is important because former literature has vilified our fermented foods from the Arctic because of the risk of botulism. So much so that when I was a student, I had a course in medical microbiology at the Technical University of Denmark. And in my textbook, it says, traditional dishes such as fish or seal flipper fermented in a barrel buried in the ground cannot be recommended by a bacteriologist. So essentially for me, becoming a microbiologist was to reject the food culture that I come from. And I think we don't need to. I think if we take the data, the preliminary data that we have, and we actually respect the people who made these fermented foods, and we listen to them when they tell us these foods were safe, they were healthy, then there's an opportunity for us to ask the question then, okay, so what role does Clostridia play in fermentation? And what role do they play in the context of our indigenous gut microbiomes, rather than just assuming at the level that we can get to with 16S that this might be botulism and perpetuating the notions that our foods are not safe to eat. And I have to say, this model of the Holobiont was very much inspired by all the learning that I had the opportunity to do with people in Greenland who ferment flippers. So I had the privilege of going to the very northernmost permanently populated place on Earth to work with fermenters there who ferment, among other things, walrus flippers in barrels. And they have incredible understanding of human microbe relationships and how that's connected to the sun and the geography that we live in. And I think I kept my talk on the shorter side because I hate conference plans that are not followed. So I wanted to make a little bit of buffer. So because I have a little bit of extra time, I just want to highlight another project that we're working with, because other than eating dried fish, including their microbiomes, where could we get microbial diversity from in our diet? So it's not that we didn't eat plants at all, but our favorite plant was also an animal-sourced plant. We used to eat the content of the caribou stomach, so eating the fiber, but also the microbes in there. So this is the gastrophagy project that Mess is working on. Mess is over there, PhD student here at the University of Copenhagen, as well as Elisabeth Sarvik, where we're interested in understanding perhaps this is a good way of getting microbes like the ones that we saw in the Hadza population. What we saw is that the gut, the stomach content, has a high fraction of Prevotella. And it's pretty safe to assume that as people, we would probably not have had a lot of Prevotellas in our guts 300 years ago before colonization because we did not eat plants. So if you wanted to get the benefit of eating plants, you should eat it out of the stomach of a herbivore. So you could get the Prevotella together with the plants. So this is an ongoing project that Mess is running. And with that, I'm going to give a little extra time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Aviâja, for such an inspiring talk, as always.
Thank you.
We have time for a few questions, so let's see. We have Tom and Thomas. Thomas and Tom. Let's start with Thomas.
Thank you so much. It's fascinating. It's important. It's enriching, and it's also completing our thinking of holobionts. Coming back, and I'm sometimes ashamed of what we are still missing, and so that's we need you. I want to just make one scientific point, which is also from your work, because your food obviously is very rich in Clostridium, and which you then learned the hard way that you shouldn't eat it, but you should eat it, because this leads now to what I alluded yesterday to, the new language. Clostridium isn't a pathogen a priori. And the term pathogen is actually context dependent. And in your case, this is a perfectly fitting normal partner or component of the holobiont. Of course, there can be instances in the human body where the same bug can now be very bad and cause diseases. So everything is context dependent. One has to understand the whole and not only specific aspects. And thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you for that comment, Thomas. Yeah, that's the whole thing. We need to understand the context to really understand the holobiont. Thank you.
Orbish.
Hi, thanks for a fantastic talk. So talking about, gastronomy, so you show the caribou gut. Some people might have had a different reaction in the audience, but if Rene Redzepi puts it on the NOMA menu, all of a sudden it's the best dish, right?
Yes.
So in terms of microbial conservation, you see a lot of stuff in scientific papers, but also in media that Mediterranean diet is like the gold standard now. And it's supposed to be promoting the healthy microbiome. But should we then, as a society, try to push for more like local indigenous diets? Because that is what was there in the first place. And instead of creating these microbial vaults, maybe a way of preservation is to promote more local-based diets, rather than conforming everybody to like a Mediterranean or a European or a Western diet, right? What
Can
are
I
your thoughts
have
on
another
that?
hour or so?
Yeah.
Because I'd like to give a talk on that.
So what are your thoughts on that?
I have a lot of thoughts on that. Yeah, so that's the primary talk that I give is around food sovereignty, that we in the Arctic need to be allowed to eat our diet. There's a very powerful global initiative to push plant-based diets, which is excellent in some context, not in our context. And I think, again, context matters. And I think there's like a big part of this is also to remind us not to always try to find the universal answer, that sometimes this can be a good answer in this specific context and not in others. And that goes for science as well as diet recommendations. Thank you for that comment.
We have time for questions. So if any of you would like to ask a question, Jakob. No, okay.
Yeah, thank you for a very nice talk. I have a quick question. So, because you have been studying, so I will present shortly after you, but to kind of give it away a bit, I'm working in Mongolia at the moment, and there's also a lot of changes in society. There's a lot of pressure, especially in the big cities, to kind of change the diet. Do you actually also see that there is medical implications, like that they're like switching for the people there to a more westernized, industrialized diet has a strong impact on their gut microbiome? And second question, if I may follow up, is there also initiatives to kind of revert back to have also a more localized diet from a political side already in Greenland?
Yes and yes and yes. Yeah, so we eat today 80% imported foods and only about, like on average, of course it differs around Greenland, and we see that in the past 2 or 3 generations, like non-communicable diseases have exploded. We have prevalence of diabetes that approaches more than 10%. It's and that we didn't see before. So yes, it is impacting our health that we're eating differently. How it is impacting the gut microbiome is research that we're working on currently, so I can't say much about that. And so for me, the argument to look beyond the biology of things means that today I use my work with microbiology and direct it towards policy making in trying to emphasize how important it is that we eat our local diet in Greenland.
So
We have 2 men with. Let's go for
I'll
Itzik
wait.
first, and we end up with Seth.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Cool.
I don't.
I'm here.
And
on your left. Yeah.
There, thanks.
Cool. Thank you. So, with regard to the projects that you mentioned, and maybe there are some prior knowledge with regard to the metabolomes or the fermentation products within the colon, for example, you mentioned propionate. We know that butyrate is also important. So, the composition itself, or the, let's say, the phylogenies, as far as these are concerned, are maybe important. Maybe more important is what they ferment these products to, and you can count on one hand on the amounts of pathways that can actually lead to different fermentation products.
Yeah, so we're currently waiting for the metabolomic data on a range of different fermented foods from Greenland, and then we'll get to that.
Within the colon,
No,
I mean.
no,
Oh,
no,
okay.
the food themselves.
This might be an important aspect. 'Cause
I'm
then you
sure.
yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. Again, Seth, last question.
Maybe, yeah, okay. Microbiota conservation is a fascinating topic for two reasons. One is you know, there's tension between the idea that microbes are everywhere and they're never going to go extinct versus the need to protect microbes because they are perhaps the most important organism to protect. And so I wonder where we as a community can start to think about where we are in that tension, our lack of knowledge, and what we should do in regards to that. And along the same lines, when we make recommendations about conservation of microbiomes, especially ethical ones, we need to consider the consequences of those recommendations on the funders who are maybe growing more skeptical around how these programs are handling conservation, and in fact inhibiting those conservation efforts that might be needed as well. And that is another source of tension. And so we need places to have these conversations that I think will be productive from this perspective of we really don't know much about what we have hopes for.
Yeah.
And with that, maybe that's a better lunch conversation, but if you have any immediate thoughts, I'd love to hear them.
Yeah, thank you. It's very true. And I think thinking that it's not either or, this seems very loud right now, that there is actually a space that we can find where it's meaningful and ethical. So perhaps an avenue would be do more localized conservation, where you have the context, like eating the narwhal's intestine and the microbiome that's in there is so dependent on so many things that taking it out of context to a centralized facility, you know, there's really a high risk of losing all the knowledge that goes into creating that diversity there. So maybe more localized efforts could be a way to do it. That would also increase the participation of different diversity of scientists, indigenous peoples, peoples of color, in participating in you know, doing science. So I think that's perhaps the funders will find that also more meaningful. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Aviâja.